Hello, BookTube. Today I'm going to review Clive James' latest readings. It's in 2010. Clive James was diagnosed with terminal leukemia and moved his library to a house in Cambridge to live, read, and perhaps even write. And these collection of reflections, essays, are sort of on what are reflections on what is might be his last readings, I guess is what the book is about. So, it ranges a bunch of things. It's funny, one of those books where he starts off with like, oh, well, I had to, like, I should read just short little things, but it's like, no, I can, I have to dive in. If I'm going to read Boswell's Life of Johnson, I'm just read the whole thing because that's beautiful. That's just wonderful. It needs to be taken all as one gulp, which is kind of funny because last year, Life of Johnson, I finally finished after eking it out over many, many years. So this shows you exactly. This guy's got a couple. Has got a lot more chops than I do. So that was the thing. And yeah, and he's start off by saying he's a wonderful writer. It's one of these things where he has all these little, he'll have all the little pithy little comments to say, sometimes cutting, sometimes insightful on the various topics. One of his big topics, I guess, seems to come up at the beginning and the end of the book, is on Hemingway, and you can tell that he's got sort of his own personal investments, as we all do with the books that we seem to come back to, or the authors that we seem to wrestle with. And Hemingway is definitely one for him, which is interesting because it's of a generation where I think Hemingway meant a lot more, and Hemingway, I'm going to say especially to male writers, where there was this whole thing of masculinity and Hemingway, and am I as macho as Hemingway, or do I reject the masculinity of Hemingway? Which, it's interesting. It's from my own perspective, whatever my masculinity is, it seems to have kind of slipped away. So that kind of debate has the Hemingway. We have to be macho and have to be powerful and suppress any of our weaknesses or doubts about our sexuality or this kind of a need to kind of pump ourselves up. There's more of a space for the male that doesn't do that, and less of an impetus that you'd have to wrestle with someone like Hemingway, at least on those terms. I've read some Hemingway, and I've actually quite enjoyed the early Hemingway. I haven't even bothered with the later Hemingway of his writing being sometimes quite beautiful and quite stark and honing. But yeah, so it's an interesting book because, yeah, he starts out with Hemingway in the beginning and talking about his envy with him. But now, as he reads them, it's like the repetitions in Hemingway can seem tedious. The nervousness about women, about sexuality, and a lot of his self-dramatization and lying. That doesn't seem that stands out more for him now, which is I think maybe sort of a thing of him also, even as an older gentleman, kind of the change of the society has wrought its changes on Hemingway from the beginning. It's a good book in a funny way because it really reminds me of BookTube in a lot of ways. I think Clive James would make an excellent BookTuber. I know he was a public broadcaster, and I'm getting terrible glare. I'm just going to put the book down. He was a broadcaster. But you've got this little section is called Extra Shelves, and it's like, oh, it's his book. It's his book tour of his shelves, and kind of pointing out sort of where everything is. And at the very end of the book, he also one of the other things that kind of reminds me of BookTube is the idea of him talking about struggling to kind of keep up with the output of modern media, and his family helping him, kind of like when they're watching The West Wing, of his daughters kind of translating Sorkinese into English, and him talking about how Proust's Community of Minds, that needing a group effort to deal with the output of all the stuff that's happening, you need that, and that usually when you have somebody who says, oh, I can interpret all that for you myself, is usually a crackpot. And I think that becomes more and more so, where something like BookTube is highly valuable, and all the different voices that you meld this all together, and you discount jokers on some stuff, and you can actually kind of get more of a accurate view of what's happening, or if not accurate, at least bring it into you in a more fulsome and rich way. So that was it's interesting to see that in there. And yeah, and it's funny because it's one of these things of encountering someone like Clive James. He's a broadcaster, which I'm sure some of you are going, duh, he's a broadcaster because you're either a certain generation or you're from England or from Australia. But I really hadn't encountered him before. I made the mistake of going on YouTube here and looking at some of his videos, and actually came off as a lot less sympathetic, a lot more cocky. I mean, there's a lot more celebrity media interviews where, you know, I think maybe more of his snark came out and that wasn't as appealing. Whereas a book like this, you know, this is truly it's a collection of essays about his reading, but really it's his biography. Like, I guess all of our work is. This is my biography, and a lot of the other booktubers I listen to, it's like we're talking about books, but we're talking about ourselves through these books. And he makes a point at the end of talking about Florence Nightingale, and from that, a biography of Florence Nightingale, and from that going on to he's like, you know, basically I see a lot of nurses nowadays, and probably it's going to get to the point where I'm only going to see nurses. And he talks about how, you know, he has a catheter and the bag bursts, and the nurse comes in to clean it up, and he's apologized, and she's like, don't apologize. This is why I'm here for you. And he talks about, you know, how that kindness that that nurse showed him was, he hopes that the sum total of his writing can kind of communicate, can bring that sort of a relief, that kind of a kindness into a person's life, which was, it's very touching. That's the Clive James that is quite good. And it's funny because at the very end of the book, he talks about Hemingway and the kind of the end of Hemingway. What's it called? It's not important, but I have to look at. It's Hemingway at the end. And that Hemingway at the end, you know, Hemingway shot himself. That he couldn't deal with his decline, and Clive James is like, you know, it was a shame that this brilliant writer, unfortunately, a lot of the seeds, his decline happened a lot earlier on. He wasn't able to kind of have that self-reflection, and that really one of the great subjects for a writer later on in his life, when he knows that he's going to die, is that decline. And, you know, who's James talking about? The fellow that's been diagnosed with leukemia, that he's talking about himself, and he's addressing that subject. And while he's talking about Hemingway, he's talking about himself and addressing the subject of his own mortality, of his own end coming, and his choice to face it, and to write quite a wonderful book about it. So that's my review. There's so much more in this book. So it's such a slim little book, but very, very compressed and wonderfully written. And yes, if you wouldn't go wrong if you're looking for some critical essays that I think get to the heart of. We're reading a book about critical essays. You know, sometimes it's like, oh, I read Hemingway or I read Connor. It's like, not really. They're not my big things, but James writing on those and talking about himself is what drew me into this book, and I hope you would give it a chance as well. So yeah, more videos later.